So here we are at the end of the third lecture on this course, a third of the way through the course, and at the end of part one, which is the exploration of humans' ethical abilities. Of course, that exploration is going to continue through the whole course. We can hardly do without it. But in the rest of the course, we'll look in part two at the consequences of discoveries in moral psychology for political change and political conflict, and then in the third part the consequences of moral psychology for ethics. So let's see how that goes. But this is the end of part one, so let me offer you a summary of where we are. The summary really is the story of our puzzles. I started by saying there's a big question: do emotions influence moral intuitions? And I quoted some famous people who said that moral psychology is all about emotion and moral intuition. I think there's much to that. And I related this big question, do emotions influence moral intuitions, to the question, what do humans compute that enables them to track moral attributes? I think those two questions are closely related. I think the answer to the first question is yes. We've got very good evidence, not conclusive, but sufficient to give a positive answer to that question. But when we try to answer the second question, we run into trouble. And that tells us that although we can give a yes-no answer to the first question, I don't think we yet have seen any good explanation of how emotions play a role in influencing moral intuitions. Now, in the lecture for this week, we focused on two phenomena in moral psychology. The first is dumbfounding. Dumbfounding leads us to the question, why is it that moral intuitions are not always a consequence of reasoning for known principles? Put this together with Schnell and colleagues and I think we can see that there must be some fairly major role for emotion and feeling. The second phenomenon that we looked at in this week's lecture is moral disengagement. Moral disengagement gives us a kind of converse thing. It gives us good reason to ask the question, why is it that moral intuitions are sometimes a consequence of reasoning from known principles? And what will be important later, when the dominant theory in moral psychology, Green et al.'s dual process theory, comes into view, what will be important later is that moral intuitions seem to be a consequence of reasoning from known principles, irrespective of whether those moral intuitions are characteristically consequentialist or characteristically deontological. So here we've got quite an interesting puzzle, a question that's very difficult to answer. And as you have seen, this is a question that I think none of the currently available popular theories which generate testable predictions can answer in a convincing way. I think this is a very difficult question for any theory to answer. But it's not the only puzzle. So earlier, going back to lecture 2, we saw that there's a question about structure. Why is it that patterns in humans' moral intuitions reflect legal principles involving harmful battery that humans are typically unaware of? Sorry, involving purposive battery. And then even before that, we had a puzzle about emotion. We want to know why feelings of disgust and perhaps other emotions influence moral intuitions. And conversely, why do we feel some things in response to encountering or thinking about moral transgressions? Why would they make us feel disgust? Particularly when there's a more obvious emotion to feel there, which is anger. What are the role of these emotions in moral intuition and the ability to perform ethically relevant actions? So you might be thinking, gosh, all we've got here is a lot of questions. And that's true. You see, as a philosopher, what I do for a living is not knowing things. That's literally my day job, to not know things. And the way I tend to not know things is to try to find questions which I think have yet to be adequately answered and which are difficult to answer. That's to say, I look for the puzzles. My job is to find the puzzles. Your job is to try to find a theory that will answer the puzzles. But you know what? I was just wrapping up there and I forgot. I wanted to mention one last puzzle before I conclude this lecture. So we touched on this before, but I want to show you some data. So here's one dilemma that we've already seen. This is the switch dilemma, also called trolley dilemma. You know the story. I'm not going to show you the video again. And we can compare this with a dilemma called drop. Now, in the past, we contrasted this with the transplant dilemma. I thought that was quicker and easier. But the idea of the drop dilemma is to create something as close as possible to switch or trolley. Except for that, in the drop dilemma, we're going to have a person drop in the way of a trolley. Now, what I want to emphasize here, so in the past I was emphasizing to you in the discussion about structure that people will very often give different answers to these two dilemmas. So that if you think there's no relevant moral difference, those answers are in some sense incompatible. Right? Whereas if, like Mikhail, you think that there is a morally relevant difference, drop involves purposive battery, whereas switch doesn't, then you don't think that that pattern is revealing any kind of inconsistency at all. So that was the past. Now what I want to emphasize to you is something new about these dilemmas. You see, Schwitzgebel and Cushman, following a variety of work earlier, found that which answer you give in switch depends on, among other things, whether or not you've already seen drop or are yet to see it. So here's the finding that they offer. It's very interesting. So let's look over here. These are non-philosophers. And what you've got here on your y-axis, these are the percentage of cases in which participants made the same judgment in switch as in drop, so treated those things as equivalent. And what you notice is that when you get switch first, people tend to give a different answer in drop. So the tendency here is to say, oh, it's okay to switch, but I'm not going to drop, but I'm not going to drop. When you do it the other way around, people tend to do something different. So they tend to say, well, I'm not going to drop. When you present them with switch, they seem more reluctant to switch. And you see that pattern even after people are given chance for reflection. And importantly, you see that pattern both in non-professional philosophers, so these we could call, ordinary subjects, and in professional philosophers as subjects. The pattern seems to be pretty much the same across those two cases. So here we have an interesting fourth puzzle, the puzzle of order effects. Why is it that people's moral intuitions about some pairs of dilemmas, certainly including switch and drop, subject to order of presentation effects? I think that's something that we also need a theory of moral intuition to explain. So then you might be saying, Steve, why are you so excited? I'm excited. I've got 4 puzzles. Why should I be excited? I haven't got a theory. No, I'm excited because I've got the 4 puzzles, because it tells me what we need to do, right? It tells me what we need to do. To understand the roles of feeling and reasoning in moral intuitions, we have to identify or create a theory that can solve the puzzles, is both theoretically coherent and empirically motivated, and it must also generate some novel, testable predictions, ideally predictions that no competing theory also generates, so that we can distinguish our theory from any other. So we haven't got a theory yet in part 1, but we do know, I think, quite a bit about human moral abilities, and we know that they are interestingly difficult to characterize. Indeed, they're perhaps so puzzling that it's worthwhile spending time, even as philosophers here, to try to figure out what's going on.